Okay, so now we have some time for question. Please, if you have a question, just try to introduce yourself with few words before for Jono. I think it's better for him to answer your question. Anyone?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my name is Majumdar. So I work with Civil International. I'm the Director General. In fact, we have been working in South Africa and we are also landing in Ghana. So I'm starting in South Africa. Our office is in Cape Town, and we have been working mostly in sanitation. So that's my introduction. My question to you is, post is change, and post, and now. I'm not asking about the now, but just now. So, do you have any practical, demonstration which has come out of all this, idea, it's a grand idea of coalition of the different situations and mindsets and the leadership from different segments. So, is there anything which is on ground as a design, which we can see that yes, this is how it is now, and possibly that was how it was earlier.
So, I think there's been a big move, for me at least, and the practitioners that I share a lot of time with, we're trying to move very far away from technical solutions as a sort of answer to things. And actually the idea of spatial narratives, and this is also coming out of the Cape Town context as well, which is very different to Johannesburg, is that to measure impact through these numbers or these sort of once-off things, the danger is that nuance of context that exists. So what we've actually learned from Slum Dwellers International's local alliance in South Africa through this idea of network, through narrative, through storytelling, which is now their big campaign around Know Your City, is actually the value of the best examples are not in what people did so much, but the story of how. How did they do it? What were the actions? What were the steps? What were the thoughts around that? So, I mean, I wouldn't answer your question with here's an example of a toilet or here's an example of a house. I really think it's about looking at how a group of people came together, and that's often the best examples are when there's some form of coming together or collaboration, and how do they understand the challenges that they faced, and then how did they work through those challenges? And to me, those examples, what I've again seen in my only 8 years of working in this context, is those have much more longevity towards actually addressing that. Because again, I'll draw from Peter and Simone. They often talk about, and they are the only ones, this sort of recognized, that we have no idea what the city will be like in 10 years' time. We literally have no precedent, or there are very few precedents for how, I'm going to just say for South African cities, of how we are urbanizing. And what the future does in the models that exist, what people talk about, is that it's going to become more informal, if that's the word we're going to use. And actually, it's not about getting rid of informality or addressing shacks through houses, but it's about understanding the city as something else. And I think that mind shift is it's a lot to take on, and there's very pressing needs for people today. Like people don't have a toilet today, they don't have electricity right now, not now. So I think there's some challenge in that immediacy that needs to be addressed, but also recognizing that it's not going to be like that in 10 years' time. So for me, I think it's much more about the how, and that's why this kind of model that I'm playing with, I'm not going to put it on there, but it's this idea of trying to act and trying to think at the same time. And I don't think everyone has the privilege to be in that position either. But again, just to very simply answer it, then the best examples of those types of networks I've seen in Durban. We have the Abashali Bas Mandronjolo, which is a civic group that have worked together the last 15 to 20 years to fight for their right, for that sort of political or their social, or their constitutional right to services and housing. So I think those type of networks are necessary and strong. The informal settlement network as part of STI, I think in the early years we're doing really strong work in that regard. And I think what I've seen again, it's people here already know these things and have their own critiques. But I spent a bit of time in the Philippines with the Community Architects Network, and I think that formation of not just the Community Architects Network, but working with various partners in different fields, legal, professional, I think those type of networks seem to yield the most sustainable in terms of energy input results. And then whatever comes out as a technical result is more a byproduct of the network.
No, that's true. And I can relate because we have done, in the ministry, I can say that we have done a lot of work on school sanitation. And we have seen that the students and the teachers, they have a lot of this, coalition of ideas, and the leadership quality, even in the students, is there. And the kind of literature which even we have developed for use, for further use of these schools. That's quite impressive, and the way they interpret a situation, interpret what should be done, and then how something should be stopped, some bad practices or malpractice, how they can be avoided or stopped. So all those things are, I can relate to all of them. In Ghana, of course, we have tried to do, we have done already some pilots, and of course, and we have taken the community, the professionals, the government officers, and we have tried to amalgamate the ideas, and we have had some 7, 8 pilots already, and then we will move up.
Yeah.
And our target is 1 million. So that's it.
Good luck.
You had a question. It's just to speak. I think. Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, I'm Kiran Devendra. I have been teaching in a university, then became an educational administrator, and back to the university now. I teach the African history as well. Now, what I feel is that the change, the situation that we expect from Africa, and I would even look at India. You look at the city of Bombay, you have the situation like this where you show the best of houses and the tin sheds. You can always find situations like this wherever there were the colonizers. That is one thing. 2, Africa was a little difficult. It had to face much more than the rest of us. And here one finds is that the solutions that are being talked about, they would get accepted at the mental level, but it would take a lot of time. The sanitation that Mr. Mukherjee was talking about, we faced the similar situation even in the total sanitation district of Trichy, where, as an educational administrator, we had gone to see whether the girls' toilets were there or not. We came across the toilets for the faculty which were locked, and they were opened only for us. So whatever suggestions you may give, how is the community going to take it, and how are the people who wish to bring a change, they want to communicate. But communication alone isn't enough. It needs to be followed up by staying with them, making them realize, he was saying by advising and all those things. It's very tough. I found a similar situation in Malaysia. So, we like to talk about these things, and let me give you another, incident in the Trichy district. We were all staying in a good hotel, and there were so many of us who, they were trying to observe who knew how to use the toilet. And many of us who were educated, they used the tissues and just dropped them on the floor. So finding solutions by academia, taking people along, that has to be a continuous effort, and I'm sure it's not going to happen in 10 years, as you have rightly said. Change has always been slow, the social. And this is also a part of social change. It is going to take much more time in a country which has faced much more difficulties of having a mindset, subjugated mindset, and it is quite difficult to come out of it. This is how I would like to look at it. And another thing that one needs to learn is that by living in places or listening from people, one can take on studies and action studies that he was talking about. I had no experience of how the houses could be built, but then a friend of mine asked me, who was in USA, that he wanted a studio to be built, and that too Laurie Baker. I don't know how many of us have heard about him. The brick construction and how the temperatures get controlled, and they are the simplest and the most practical part of it. But then when I tried doing it, I tried to beautify it with the arches and other things that could bring in more air. So what I'm trying to say is that people need to take interest. And that too, I would add to it, genuine one.
So, Jana, I was sort of curious about this approach that you've sort of described that your organization has taken. It's obviously challenging sort of the larger paradigm of how planning, design or architecture is being thought of perhaps in the country. I don't know, that's one question. I mean, how accepted is it? How do you see resonance among academics or other practitioners, maybe across other cities? Is it very specific to Johannesburg and your organization? So I didn't get a sense of whether this is like, oh, we're doing new things, and we're trying easier, or whether this is like a wider, a need that is being simultaneously felt from many quarters with, so I mean, I'm only familiar with the shack dwellers, slum dwellers kind of paradigm, and I know that they're doing a number of things in a number of places. So that's one question. And the second question was, because we see this a lot in India, that the policy direction set by the government often sort of becomes the default mode to which a lot of practitioners try to align their own, for obvious reasons, align their own more praxis too. So is that also something you face, and if there's a divergence between the tone that that government policy sets and what's actually needed on the ground, how is that sort of divergence dealt with?
Cool. Just writing your questions down.
I know,
so-
sorry.
It's fine. I'm not
It's up to
watching
you. You can
answer.
answer now, or we have one
You
more
can
question.
do
It's up to you.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah, one more question.
You want to answer them?
No, cool. I'm writing them down. I'm not checking on Twitter, I promise.
Hi, I'm Bala. I'm an architect, urban designer. I also teach urban design and architect students, and I've also been in practice. My questions to you as a designer who's into this kind of work is more spatial. When you work with communities, and when you sometimes we realize that we are given or not given, but we kind of have to work with very little space, which are mostly end up being the streets that are already clogged with services and mobility and all of these functions that are essential for the communities. And maybe once in a while you might find a little bit of space which is, say, as big as this room. Then you have to take these decisions in terms of what do you make in those spaces? Do you make, like, who takes those decisions? What sort of trade-offs does somebody do, and who makes those decisions during that time? Is it better to provide them a toilet, or is it better to give them a school, or is it better to give them, or just leave it open because they can use it as a multi-purpose space? So have you ever had any sort of decisions like that to make, and how do you make them?
Cool. Want to answer those before we move on?
Yeah.
There are
Okay,
quite a few.
great. So the first one, yes, do people challenge this? I made a rule about 3 years ago for myself. I said I'll never, ever again argue with an architect or anyone about whether what I do is architecture or not. I just found it a very, not productive discussion. And the kind of, on my academic high horse, the quote that I always like to reference is from an architect actually in the UK named Jonathan Hill, who says, the term architect is protected by law, doctor, lawyer, architect, but the term architecture isn't. So Okay, that's the end of his quote. So everybody in the world practices architecture by making things and building things and doing it every day. We all practice architecture. But if you're in a course of an architect, cool, go study for 7 years, pay lots of money, and then be broke the rest of your life, as most architects are. So I don't want to argue anymore about, am I an architect? And that's why in the beginning I made the disclaimer to say, doesn't matter. I've studied my degree, I've got my professionalization. But the practice of what I do is an architecture, and people make architecture. And we've worked with that kind of idea. So we actually don't even use the word architecture in one-to-one. There's two words that we try not use. So architecture is one. It's all about neighborhoods. It's about city. It's about making. It's not about design. The design's hidden in there, but we try to avoid the term architecture or architect unless we're talking to them. The other one is community. Because often we find that the way people use this term is basically a signifier in South Africa for poor non-white people. Because there's no like rich communities that people are helping. There's no middle like, so we talk about neighborhoods or maybe communities in a neighborhood, plural, but not the community. I think it's something we've been very careful with to challenge, because then it becomes, well, what is community participation? And if you go into Twitter or Instagram, you can look up a hashtag. It's quite long. It's hashtag, it's not participation unless somebody points at a map. Because that's what participation with community becomes about. It's like a bunch of people pointing at a map saying, yes, we've all agreed on something, and like it's nonsense. It's obviously a much more complex and layered process. So we try to work with ideas of approaches and tools and methods. And that actually leads me into the second question is our relationship with local official, government officials, people in practice who are architects, engineers, planners, because of their own, whether it's because of government role or they're in a practice that needs to make money, so they're providing a service that they've been hired by someone. What we find as an interesting entry point in regards to that mindset has been this development of tools and methods and approaches. So these things, like these things, they become ways that we can design with people, and they kind of in a way are quite like sexy because they're kind of projected on it's very cheap. It's just a projector in a very dark room in a dark alley, but it's a way that we can very cheaply take a process which is a policy document about inner city zoning. That's actually the urban boundary of inner city Joburg, and we can have a conversation about policy with somebody like Debbie on the right, on the left there, who's not a technical person, but we have a similar language to talk about it, or this or these tools, codes of engagement, or just simple post-its and things like that, using kind of these very simple ways of making the issue. Or this one. This is actually one of our strongest tools, which is about using a timeline to talk to a group of people about what their development strategy or their tactic is. Because they already know what it is. They already know how they want to do it, but there maybe isn't cohesion amongst the various voices at a grassroots level. So things like that have been a way that we've found value can be brought to like a space in certain ways. And then our role becomes about facilitating a process. So we become like useful, or sometimes, most of the time, I think we get in the way, but we find a use around being valuable outsiders through tools and methods. And that actually leads me to my third question for Bala, is I think it's these types of processes that we arrive at ideas. Okay, so this process was about a thing called reblocking, which maybe some of you are familiar with. This group of people wanted reblocking, and they wanted it tomorrow, because in their minds, reblocking was about houses. But actually, Dumasani, who's part of our team there, he's been through a reblocking process before, so we went through a whole unpacking of what that group of people need. Let's say there's a history, it's like the past. What they're currently looking for there in the middle is the now, not the now, and then there's the future. And then we said, if you want to do reblocking, this is a 2, 3, 4, 5-year timeline. Is it really what you want? Again, it's not just me saying that, it's a whole bunch of different people. Dumasani, the students are there. We really break apart the way that the voice is carried. Then it becomes another type of conversation. Okay, maybe we won't be blocking in 2 years' time, but tomorrow we just want electrification. So then the leadership decides that's our tactic. We're pushing the ward councillor for that. No, we're going to private sector to get donations to this. No, we're going to do it ourselves. And again, there's no answer to that, but it's about people deciding for themselves, and they already have the decision. These processes just kind of lift them, or they bring them together, and they don't always work. This tool, most of the time, people are too busy, or we don't have the right space. But again, we keep coming back, or we do it differently, or we walk away. If the project doesn't need us, we're not there to solve this stuff. We're there to provide the service. And that's how we've taken a sort of positional position on this, is that if people don't want us there, then we must go. But in a way, we have kind of claimed, not like them, but more like this diagram here, there you go, that this is our community. We are part of this professional practitioners who work, So we can be more adversarial in those spaces. We can push back and say, no, the way that you, planning group, is doing participation is actually placation, and you're lying, and you haven't spoken to anyone, you've done one meeting, so we can challenge them. So we can be much more, I'd say, like aggressive in those spaces, or with the sort of Just Urbanism initiative, which is about, really making declaration. What does spatial inequality look like? What do you mean? Like, of course, I live 40, 50 km outside the city. That's just how people live who look like me. Like, is it? No. Like, let's build a conversation around that. So the way we framed our kind of organization speaks about those different positions which we can occupy. It also frames the different ways that we can work. So the Neighborhood Maker Initiative is much more about building and making and doing things with different groups of people. It doesn't always allow for these more adversarial positions, but vice versa. When you make in those sort of spaces, people challenge you. And so this way of creating these three kind of avenues of engagement, we can call it that, has allowed us to do that, and also to kind of then, look back. And again, when this goes public, you can see, but those are all our different beneficiary groups that we've worked with over the years. And we've seen actually most of our beneficiary groups have been around the critical practice. You can see that, it's the longest line. We've actually had the most success in these spaces because it's much quicker to, like those are our short-term wins. And actually the Neighborhood Maker, which is one that typically like NGO-type groups and nonprofits position themselves as, in our sector, as architects, those are much longer timelines. Those are 5, 10, 15 years things. And again, the Just Urbanism is a sort of in-between in that space. So I think there's different ways of looking at change, there's different ways to measure it. And we're not saying it can't be done, but we're just declaring our position in this bigger debate.
Do we have more questions? Yes.
I'm Pushpa Pathak. I am not an architect. I am an urban planner, let's say. I've done actual development work, but lastly I was teaching at the School of Planning and Architecture. Very interestingly, your work, I find, is centered around this reflective practitioner, and I want to share with you that there was a conference at MIT in October last year, and which was 30 years after revisiting reflective practitioners. So you may be interested in that discourse that went on there, and it is at the SPURS program, Special and Urban Regional Planning website, and it was the 50th reunion of the program, and I was amongst the oldest participants. I think before me there were 3 or 4 batches. I participated in that program in 89-90. And interestingly, I'm sharing this information with you, there were several examples of this kind of neighborhood design work that were presented there across the world. We had several presentations. And one of the learnings I came back from there, or it came up again and again, was that there are 2 discourses going on simultaneously. One at the community level, design, coming up with better design and better quality of life with people. And the other is going on at the policy planning, formal planning level. And wherever the 2 discourses talk to each other, it was more effective. So it's the kind of that dialogue. Where is that space, and what tool are you using in your program for the 2 discourses to talk to each other, is my question. But also you may look at the material that is available.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
I mean, thank you very much, because I think, where's he? There you go. He's, Don Chan is, exactly, he's like famously part of the alumni, and in my meetings with people over the years, every time somebody resonates with his work, I find there's some link back to MIT, or and I've applied to this PERS program twice now. The first time I didn't have enough money, and the second time the American State Department didn't have enough money, so I blame Trump.
You have to change your color, then you will get it.
Oh, okay, I'm not going to answer that. But thank you. I think that's a really great references, I think, for anyone. I got lots from that process. And I think that's why we use the term neighborhood instead of communities, because often it's the last scale of community, actually. Like anything bigger than that, it starts to not become one group, or not one group of people, but one type of agency around space. And often, people make decisions back in South Africa, and I'm sure it's similar here, for the community of these people. There's people. How can they be one community? But conversely, that also gets used by people on the ground to be collective. So we are the community of this area, so we can fight back the government. But when it comes time to plan or to implement, I think that terminology becomes a bit tricky. So for us, neighborhood becomes a lot sort of safer in a way. Obviously, it has its own complications, but it also allows more people to enter the conversation. Because if you talk about the dwelling, it's too personal. If you talk about the region, it's too big, and it's so for us, neighborhood is a way that and I think it's it's been a very good way for us to do it. And then your question about how the tools meet. So I'm so visual. So this tool here this is the field tool. What we've done is we've actually taken the same tool, we use it in a government office. And there's a very strong policy instrument called the Upgrading of Informal Settlements Policy in South Africa. It's been in place for 10 years. Literally, there's been a handful of projects used by this program, but it allows for people to engage a lot more in the process. But many local officials don't even know that it exists or how to use it. So what we've done recently, the last year, is we've made what we call it a roadmap, and we've used this timeline kind of tool, and we put the UISP roadmap onto it. And now we're having conversations with residents of informal neighborhoods who are trying to do this work, with local officials and with the private sector. And that's been really useful. And that's actually got us into a lot more interesting spaces in the city, because then, one-to-one is the group bringing this tool to the table. And then we can bring in these values around spatial practice. And so I think that's definitely been something that we've seen working, and it's exactly that. It's a confluence of the policy and implementation. It's like, how does the how work and how does the how look? And what we sort of see value in that is it allows lots of people to understand the process, but also to enter the process at different stages. Because you try to bring too many people in too early or too late, so that's really been helpful for us. And we're busy trying to. It's more a way again to bring value to a process like this, but we're transforming this, not just this tool, but a series of other kind of tools around this way of talking over time, into an app. That the app is not to replace the practitioner, the app is to carry the knowledge and to kind of, again, bring us into other spaces. So where this nice desktop tool or this community hall tool works, an app works in like another way. And that app, we're calling it the Neighborhood Builder app. So I think these are all interesting moments that we found when you make these tools, or you're part of the process to implement these tools, we can meet policy at implementation and start to have a really kind of rich role in that.
Yeah.
The leadership.
Sorry.
Go ahead. It's okay if you follow up.
So I'm Isha from the Center for Research. Thanks for this interesting presentation. So I had a bunch of questions. So one was around, again, going back to the whole question of reflective praxis. I was hoping if you could maybe build on with some more concrete examples of your engagement in terms of, you began the talk by talking about identities as urban practitioners, researchers, where you are in a neighborhood. So how has that process come through in the sense of, just like the term community is problematic, even a term like neighborhood is not homogeneous. So, and if there is a demand for electrification or, say, reblocking, it's not everyone, and there are definitely fault lines. So I was wondering how, as practitioners, do you navigate that landscape, or do you leave it for the residents themselves? Where do you see your engagement? Because, again, I'm not a practitioner, but from my research in urban areas, and particularly informal settlements in Delhi, we do find, and I'm sure this is something that comes across studies, there are definitely internal fault lines and differentiations. And perhaps if I was to just give a very simple example, one would be, like, say, in a lot of Indian cities, migrants versus the locals, and so which I know is a sentiment also in South Africa. So I was wondering, how do you navigate that landscape? And secondly, we were briefly talking about this, but again, as researchers, we are interested in this also larger urban discourse. There's a lot of talk about collaboration, co-production, and there are also criticism in the sense of it being a very top-down approach. So as reflective practitioners, how do you look at some of these discourses? I was wondering if you would have any insights from your work.
So I think there was actually a point, so I'm going to segue into your point. There was a comment that I wanted to make earlier when Mukhtar asked. I think there's a voice, at least on the architectural side of things, that often wants to challenge this type of work, not to challenge it constructively, but I think at least at home, and that came up a lot with the student work, is that students say, no, we shouldn't do this work. Like, architecture is about this, or my role is about this, or that's the government's job. Often these answers that they gave us, they're more indicative of their own relationship to society and their own role, their own interpersonal. So they'll come at the problem academically and technically, but actually it's about their own relationship to the challenge. And I think it's like a kind of a Trojan horse in a way. And I think that's what I find a lot of the time back home, at least because these are my people, so I can speak for them, is that's where they're coming from. So that's why I don't argue the architecture thing, and I try to talk about the issues. But I think there's a similar practice or habit in research that I found. And again, we must be critical, we must critique, we must challenge things. But I often wonder if when we look at something like you propose a model or you do something, this is a way to do it, because it's coming from someone like myself in a room like this, on a screen like that, it's often perceived as like the answer or a very strong gesture towards fixing or addressing. And I don't know how else to present these things, that this is like one way of many ways that exist, and here's the way that we've chosen to do it. So I think nothing that I presented today, I'll stand by and say this is 100% like anyone would. And I really we at the beginning of one-to-one, we really spoke about not an alternative mode of practice. We said we're not trying to practice alternatively, because then it's just like everyone's wrong and now we have it right. I think we try to talk about an additional mode of practice. So this is another way to do it. We think it's a really good way. We think it's got a lot of value, but it can change. So I think for me, the things around reflective practice or reflection in practice or in action, and that's what I took that quote from Don Schoen about design as a way of talking to the site. And I think design and also these research models or these ideas, they get seen as such a solutionary thing, but I mean, I don't see them as that. And I guess I need to learn better how to frame them in a way that doesn't come across. But I really don't think that any of these models, any model that anyone presents, should be the way. It should be like one other way and many different ways to do it. And the more of these ways we have as our arsenal or our tool set, and the more access we have to them and conversations around which ones work when, or how do we pull these tools apart and rebuild them in different ways, I think that's what I'd like to keep exploring with my own work and my own research. And I'm trying to think if I answered your question. So this thing about, and this comes into your question about people's process, is that I think there's a lot of important rhetoric around people leading their own development process, which I really do believe. And there's a lot of discussions about the kind of limits of practice. And I think we don't want to talk about the limits of grassroots agency as well, because it's not nice. It's like, no, we're spending all this time building up a group of people who've been disadvantaged for so long. We mustn't do that. So I don't want to say that people on the ground can't do things at a certain level, but I do think there's some discussion around where people's value lies. So one of our demographic groups, or what you call these things, is technically skilled residents. So because we've done a lot of work where people like to romantically discuss about, community architects, and again, I don't care about these terms, but we want people to have agency that maybe doesn't exist. And often then, when those projects fail, it's not when they fail, but if they fail, those people are the ones to blame. Community wasn't engaged, or community let this project down, or it wasn't the right community, and it's not fair. We put the most vulnerable part of a project on the weakest component. So if the community is not the most unified, cohesive, evangelic, mobilized, then that's why it failed, because there wasn't perfect community voice, and there's never perfect. Yeah. So I think, in terms of people leading the process, yes, I think always there must be a discussion, and I think certain projects will have a much stronger grassroots voice, and others might not. But it doesn't mean it's not a community-led process if, like we've worked on Slovo Park the last 10 years, if they're the ones telling the planners where to put the roads, or they're the ones organizing that planner for whatever reason. I think the idea of what is a community-led process or people's voice, it often gets held to such a high idea that it's only, and again, those are often probably so rare, like how many examples? People always talk about Orange in Pakistan, or this one example in Thailand, or this one example, and we have a planet of 8 billion people, but we choose 3 or 4. And so I think I'd like there to be a nuance of critique in how we talk about implementation and whose voice gets happen. And we can look at a range of practices of spatial development and find ways to be more, to unpack the additionality of practice. Cool.
Do we have more questions?
I was asking one thing.
We'll go first with Pablo and then you want more.
Hi,
If
yes,
that helps.
the fun stuff of not having to organize workshops in our space. Thank you, John. It was very nice. If I could ask you to reflect on your immediate past. You spent time, I believe, in Ahmedabad before coming here. And both in terms of, so it's two kinds of issues. The way I see South African planning is that it did have a very strong inheritance of order and method, so to speak, which is institutionalized in various branches of government. And obviously, they're going to have such a rigid order society. And I'm trying to understand how much of your current engagement within academia and with new students and the reflections you have with various planning organizations in government, and whether in your method, I think this question came up earlier, whether, let's say, there's a difference whether you're in Cape Town or Durban or Johannesburg. And the second is to reflect on your experience with Ahmedabad, which brings up many imaginations in many people's, when you look at the city. And to try, and you also engage with students there. So what, if we just look at your engagement with students at the University of Johannesburg and at CEP, and also at the city of Ahmedabad and the city of Johannesburg, from the lens that you have just used here, how do you sort of describe it?
Cool. Yeah, another question here, then I can do both.
That's fine.
So other people can.
Yes.
Well, since my interest is in practical things, so there's a very small question about the community leadership that you had mentioned about. How big is the group usually, and do they have any government sanction or something? I mean, do they have any legal powers to deliberate on things?
Great. So maybe I can answer both together. Actually, that's quite good. So first of all, I'll go with Ahmedabad. To be honest, I've been teaching in CEPT, and I've been inherited a module under Dr. Jigna Desai. So I wouldn't say tactically, but I very consciously made the decision that I'm here to teach sort of methods and tools, and I actually rely a lot on my co-tutor, who's a local Gujarati, to do a lot of the engagement with leadership. Obviously because of the language barrier, but also because I'm leaving in May, and I try not to create too much of a reliance around my presence, at least. So in terms of the city, and in terms even of the pole that we're working in, which is Manvini pole in the old city, all my kind of experiences have been, I would say, more as a lay person than as a urbanist. I'm still learning about Ahmedabad. I'm still learning about the history of that area, and this is now only the third city I've seen in India is Delhi. So I really wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on the city at all. And even to that extent, in South Africa, my background is not planning. My background is again only in architecture and training, but I'm talk more about sort of city experience. But I think some of obviously the starkest contrasts, and we're talking a bit about it now at lunch, is the kind of sense of safety, I think, that at least a city like Ahmedabad has, that Johannesburg really doesn't. The fact that I can lock my bicycle no, I don't lock my bicycle. I just put it in the rack and then I go to class and I come back and it's still there. I'm still every day completely shocked by that. I can't get over that. And the way I think that even people talk about crime and stuff that happens, I still see people on the streets. I still see things happening. I still see traders. I still see like a really vibrant, this is here in Delhi and in Ahmedabad. I mean, like, I think Delhi has similar, what I've heard is similar fears about crime. I still see people on the streets. And in South Africa, or at least in Johannesburg, we have a very different relation to the street. The street is a very dangerous place. People still use it, but somehow it's still very dangerous. And that's particularly in Johannesburg. Where I grew up in Durban, we have an amazing public space, which is our beachfront, which ironically is a legacy of the World Cup, which did so many terrible things to our country and many others. But the beachfront project was this amazing upgrade in Durban, and it's created a whole new public space that we didn't even know we could have 20 years post-apartheid ended. So I think it's probably one of the few places in South Africa where we can say we've got public space right. Again, a lot of people, but these people can't use it. Again, it's holding up the weakest part of our society to the highest critique. And then Cape Town is a whole nother kettle of fish. And again, because the demographics of South Africa, white people are 5% of the population, more or less. And in Cape Town, I think the black population is 15% of Cape Town, and then 40% is Cape colored. So white people are the majority in the Cape, or in Cape Town. So it makes the space a whole nother set of dynamics. And often people will say, but Cape Town, it's not an African city, you know. What they want to say is it's not a black city. But they don't want to say that because it's a city on the continent. I don't know where else this is. But we don't have that language to talk about it. So Africanness is blackness, you know, like, so Cape Town is not an African city. And again, we all know what they really mean. And because it's very well managed, some would say, again, very like clean streets, all these, yeah, it's very, very sanitized. And you have a very poor population living directly, you literally land when you go into Cape Town in some of the poorest parts of the city, which actually aren't. I mean, Volvorovia, Atlantis, those have really dire conditions, but it's very stark, this sort of poverty that you land in, and then you drive into Camps Bay and you, in 20, 30 million rand times 5, so what's that, 100 million rupees plus houses. So I think people read the city in a particular way, but you know, effectively Johannesburg is much more unequal in its bigger measurement, but you can't absorb Johannesburg. It's too big. It's not as big as Delhi, but it's much bigger than Cape Town, and it's hard to move around. So I think these comparisons in South Africa are difficult enough, and Ahmedabad I'm still processing. But like I said, the idea of safety and this idea of kind of street togetherness that I really, really appreciate is something that I definitely take back, and that the students do. So we send them to do site visits, they go. I don't have to worry about student safety. And back at home, our students being robbed all the time. I have to be careful. I can't say, go to that site, you haven't done your research. They can very comfortably say, I can't go there, it's too dangerous. We must change the project, we must shift the inquiry. So I think these are interesting dynamics that we have to kind of live with on a daily basis in South Africa. And then again, I think you're right. The apartheid model didn't just come out of nowhere. It was based on the colonial model, which separated people based on native and European and these different and their own versions of apartheid long before that. And I mean, those really did set in place the kind of the cornerstone of what was the apartheid city later on. And then the last question about groups, and I think this definitely plays out in that regards.
Whether they have any legal. Is there any legal sanction than their groups?
So this, I mean, I can maybe Pragna can speak better about this, but it's different. So at a neighborhood level, let's talk about Slovo Park, where I've worked a lot. It's 5,000 people, and they've elected a development forum, so it's 6 people. But the development forum is supported by a business forum, which is actually the local businesses who support them, and they're part of maybe that regional group of the informal settlement network, which is maybe 20 people in that network. You look at about 50,000 people in that area, who then report to one group, which is then SDI. But Plan Act have their own groups, SERI have their own groups, there are different civil groups that exist in our country, Sanko. So I think these groups differ depending on their higher affiliation. I've only worked with groups through the SDI Alliance and through some link to the university in Johannesburg. And obviously in Durban, Abeslali Bas Mandonjolo is supported by outside groups. And again, I'm not sure of their political affiliation. But I think this link to the civil and politics in South Africa is very close. Often there's there's a political history behind that, and I'm sure Pragna can speak much, and Anil can speak much better about that than I can. Yeah.
Do we have more questions? No, okay. Thank you, Jono, for your presentation. Please note down that the next CPR-CSH workshop will be held in the very same room, 38th of April.